Hey, hello everyone. Great day. Want to welcome everyone to a roundtable discussion, and I'm very excited today for this live stream. We have a lot of great people, contributors participating on this, and we are simulcasting this across multiple platforms, not only over on the Gadfly VHX.tv, but also on the Rogue News platform. And V will be joining us here in a little bit, but joining us currently right now, we do have London Paul of the SiriusReport.com. So make sure you go check out his work over there. Great articles, also his premium content that he makes available with his daily podcast that I'm a subscriber as well. And then don't forget about Ken Schortgen Jr. of Shotgun Economics. Ken and I did a podcast the other day discussing his most recent article, which is titled Populist Revolution Moves from Washington to Wall Street. So check that out. And then also we have Veles. Veles is one of the contributors over on Rogue News. And so, gentlemen, great day. How's everyone doing?
Morning, all.
Yes, morning. Yeah, very well. And yourself?
Doing fabulous. We're here February the 3rd. Veles, you doing okay?
I'm good, sir.
Okay. All right. Good deal. Just here we are kicking off February 3rd. We're seeing a lot of changes, a lot of things that are happening. And I thought what we could do today to kick off the roundtable discussion is just some opening statements from each of you, maybe 5 minutes of what's on your radar, things in consideration. Then we can jump into those conversations, make it easier for the people listening in to follow along. So we'll start with you, Ken, if you want to kick things off first, and then we'll go to Paul.
Yeah, yesterday I heard Jay Powell stepped out of the Eccles building. He saw his shadow, so there'll be 6 more years of QE. For those who forgot, yesterday was Groundhog Day. Anyway, the funny thing that's going on right now is that it's impossible to predict anything because everything is being reactionary, whether it's politics, whether going on in Myanmar, whether it's going on with the attacks between the Robin Hood and the hedge funds, what Congress is planning to do, what the Fed keeps talking they're doing. Oh, we need to taper this and that. Everything in the world is reactionary. You got to wear 2 masks. No, you got to wear 4 masks. No, wait a second. Masks don't work. Everything is reactionary. It's meant to confuse. It's meant to obfuscate. It's meant to get people from thinking about the real issue. And the real issue is that the U.S. empire, U.S. hegemony is dying. And that's something we've talked about here on the Gadfly over and over and over and over. This great reset they're trying to push. I mean, we just got done with all the QAnon stuff. We've got the great reset that's being foisted upon. We've got Mario Draghi becoming the new leader in Italy, God forbid. Meet the old boss, or meet the new boss, same as the old bosses.
Yeah,
the
it's like a
West
vicious
is
cycle.
Trying to keep the status quo while the world moves rapidly away from the old system, and that really is the focus people have to go on. Is all this stuff you see in the U.S., all this stuff you see in Europe, they're trying to hold on to a dead system, not a dying system, a dead system, and only those who are prepared for what's going to take place in the new paradigm are going to really be able to thrive, much less survive.
Yeah. Paul, go for it. What's on your radar? Your thoughts, please.
Well, as I always say, everything's on my radar. That's because of the nature of what we do. But in a very broad sense, we're seeing, and Ken's kind of alluded to this, we're seeing the collapse of one empire and how that's functioning in its state of collapse, and how it tries to convince, I'm not sure who it's trying to convince, probably itself, that it still has relevance and significance. And for me, so there's that focus as you see, okay, how's this empire collapsing? How is it reacting to situations? What is it doing to try and circumvent the notion that it is collapsing? And then the flip side is you look at the East, which is, the Eurasian multipolar axis, which is the ascendant power. And you look at the stark difference between both empires, and you're seeing how this sort of flashpoints and interaction exists between these two empires, and it's playing out. I mean, we can talk later, the whole Navalny situation, that's a great example of how a failing empire is trying to convince the world that one of the ascendant nations in the Eurasian axis is somehow, this bogeyman. I mean, and obviously Russia in this case. And you're still seeing how there's an attempt to try and convince the world that China's the same, or the West is. And then, of course, you have the Russian vaccine that suddenly the Lancet is saying that it's a very successful vaccine. And you're talking about Europe's now looking at maybe adopting it once it goes through regulatory review. So there's all these conflicting things playing out. It's like the European Union signs a trade deal with China. Attempts to upend Nord Stream 2 are failing, and Germany's just put its foot down and said, no, that's not happening. So you're also starting to see some sort of, I've always said Europe's the key battleground in this, and it has been historically for a very long time. So you're seeing how Europe's starting to, on the one hand, it's up in arms about Navalny, and on the next breath it's going, well, actually, we might like your vaccine. Yeah, we want Nord Stream 2. Yeah, we want this enormous investment trade deal with China. And because it's starting to go, we need to embrace this new empire, but we can't be seen to upsetting the Americans, even though, of course, in reality, the whole world knows the US as an empire, as a hegemony, is now in terminal decline and has been for a considerable period of time. So there's always those folk, it's worth looking, okay, these are the things the ascendant power's doing. What is the collapsing empire doing? And conversely, how is it trying to, as you say, convince people that it's not collapsing, or what's it doing? It's being kind of quite reactionary. So, foreign policy is what it is, but we're seeing some very sort of contradictory US foreign policy, which maybe we can come to later. So I think they're the obvious things in a very broad sense that I'm looking at.
Very good. Very good. Veles.
Good morning. Yes, I concur with my colleagues. The other thing is I'm stunned in some respects by two things. The first is that 2 years or so before Donald Trump's election, and even during his election, we had a lot of discussion internationally about using the language that's used in these circumstances, which is international regimes, basically intra or extra governmental organizations worldwide that monitored trade, standards of trade, standards of finance, and similar. And you could always find a lot of that on the news. And just the last 2 years or so, definitely since the election, it's just been quiet. I know the World Economic Forum has had their meeting, and I know what Paul thinks of the WEF. It's a joke, Paul. But it just seems quiet in that regard. The other thing that's on my radar among many is I'm utterly stunned I shouldn't be, because I worked in the Beltway in Washington, D.C. for a number of years. I lived in D.C. for a number of years, and I know the prevailing attitudes, especially at the higher levels. But the news this morning off of Zero Hedge was that Janet Yellen has been issued an ethics waiver so that she may personally lead the regulator meeting on what occurred with GameStop, even though she took $810,000 from Citadel. And we've had a whole host of other things in the current administration, including but not limited to one of the lawyers from the legal team defending Hunter Biden has been appointed to a regulatory agency. Peter Strzok's wife, which I'm amazed they're even still married after everything that came out. She's now the enforcement regulator for the SEC. I feel like the Chicago Mafia is just like taking positions on the nightly news, and those of us on this end of the scale are rolling our eyes going, how is this even possible? But because we have uniform control of our media by 5 major corporations, they're just continuing on like nothing happened.
Yeah, it's very interesting indeed. And Ken, I want to give you the first opportunity to expand on the conversation, whether it's your own or Paul's or Veles. Which would you like to dive into first?
One of the things that they tried to push, and a lot of you got to go through the morass of the conspiracy theories and stuff that actually was conspiracy. There was a lot of talk before Trump got into office that Hillary Clinton was going to bring about the final nail in the coffin of the American Republic after 8 years of Barack. Well, if you look at what Biden has done so far, Biden has pretty much brought in most, if not all, the major players who were in the Obama administration into positions where they have, extreme power. There's talk that there's a new bill coming in that's going to pretty much hamstring the Second Amendment. There's a constitutional amendment that's being thrown out to get rid of free speech. Pretty much, they're not even hiding it anymore. And this is where the end of the empire. Everybody knew that Nero, was insane, and everybody knew that Nero was seeking to destroy through his corruption Rome. That's what's happening today. Janet Yellen's a whore, plain and simple. She'll sell out to anybody. She was a bureaucrat in the Fed for
I want to qualify that you mean that in a governmental sense.
Exactly. Exactly. We're not talking sexual. We're talking the metaphorical way. She'll sell out to the highest bidder. We used to make fun of Greenspan because Greenspan, before he got really into the Fed, he was an advocate, an acolyte of Ayn Rand, big gold. But you know what? When they offered him the job to run the Fed, he quickly prostituted himself to the fiat currency system. So, Jay Powell, you know what? I have to wonder if he even has any understanding of economics at all. Either that or he's the biggest tool in the world. So with this being said, everybody is selling out at all costs to get their ideology, to get their power, to destroy America for I don't even know what reason. It's almost like it's not a matter of keeping the American empire going. It's like what happened you saw in places like New Harmony, Indiana, or even what the guy who was in charge of the camps building Hoover Dam, the worker camps in Hoover Dam. There's this desire by psychopaths to instill this utopian, paradise that they want, but they're dividing everybody in order to do it. So, I'm looking for a ray of hope of what's going to come. But the fact of the matter is that what we have going on financially, politically, in the West is inevitable. And it's why I've said there is no reform. Even Donald Trump, at the very most, what he did is he slowed this down. But in the end, it ran right over him like a steamroller, and now it's continuing on as if we had transitioned from Obama to Hillary. So these are the most important things that I want to stress. And it's not a matter of being, just negative and pessimistic. The fact of the matter is, the world, the West, the United States is heading towards a specific end goal, and you really can't fight it per se. What you need to do is protect yourself, because the winner in all this is not going to be the U.S., but the losers in this are going to be the American people.
Yeah, very well said. Paul, your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, Ken summed it. Yeah, exactly. It's the people who will lose. I think I always come back to what I said, that the biggest fallout from the virus would be it would shine a light on all the illusion, and eventually people would see the reality of everything. And for me, I think that's been the biggest sort of setting aside, I'm not trivializing anybody who's died. And I'm going to come on to a point shortly which highlights why Western governments, for want of a better description, are incapable of handling adversity. And the virus has proved that. I know, setting aside people's conspiracy theories, for me, I just deal with what I see as factually the case. So the problem as well you have within these governments that are incapable of handling extreme adversity or a real problem is, of course, when empires collapse, and this is where you're right, Ken, there's all these competing forces. There's these spheres of influence who want to remain relevant. And therefore there comes a point when these competing forces will effectively run roughshod over everybody else to do so. And that's why I think the whole sort of tech empire is trying to do that. I don't think there's some centrally controlled individuals going, right, you need to do this. I think it's the tech empire is trying to think it can somehow become a dominant force in the future, and is trying to assert itself. And there are other competing influences who are furious about this and want to bring an end to it, because they see that this tech industry or tech sector could become so dominant. And it's interesting. It's one thing when we talk about it, and I think I said a few years ago, the intention was to break up the big tech giants. But it's happening in China. China's looking at this and going, hang on, we don't want to see this happening. So look at what they've done with Ant Group. I mean, and Ant Group's actually agreed, I mean, someone may say under duress, but they've kind of agreed to change and some reform, because they're looking at these big behemoths going, hang on, we need to do something about this, because they're looking at the future problems. And I don't, it's not unique also to the United States. Europe's looking in the same vein. So I think it's one of those situations where these big spheres of influence, where they've coexisted, they're not coexisting anymore, because when an empire collapses, someone's going to try and fight to stay relevant. Someone wants to believe that somehow they can be the phoenix that rises from the ashes. And I made a tweet earlier with regards to, and I've had some dealings, and I've said this before, with UK government and their policy advisors on the virus. And I made all this point to them back in the summer and for this is the problem. If a government virus policy saves a single life, but the indirect consequences destroy, I don't know, 10, 100, 1,000 lives, because of all the economic considerations, there's all the other physiological problems, the psychological problems, all the societal issues, alcoholism, domestic abuse, violence, then it's an utter catastrophic failure. But what you see in the United Kingdom is they are tunnel vision. They can only look at one thing, and they're just solely tunnel visioned and focusing on this. And the analogy is they're trying to save this one life in a burning building, and someone's going to, hang on, there's 1,000 lives there. No, this is what we're focusing on. So they'll sacrifice all this because they think this will solve the problem, because they don't look at the unintended consequences or indirect consequences. And it's the same in how the West is collapsing. There's all these corners fighting their own corner, thinking, well, we can stay relevant, we can survive. And yet not realizing, in fact, it's utterly futile. And this is why you see certain sectors, and we've talked about this before, the financial banking sectors going, we want to stay relevant, what can we do? So they're knocking on the door in Asia going, can we be part of the revolution, of the ascending empire? And gradually they're making inroads, but of course they're going to have to work in an entirely different environment. So you're going to see also this idea of, the big corporations are going to survive and everything else will fail. Now, ultimately, in this model, they're all going to fail, because it's quite simply, if you end up putting an entire population destitute, they're not going to support the corporations because they won't have any money to support them. And those corporations depend on all of us to function and exist. But let's say when empires collapse, they'll all try and fight. They'll all think they can be relevant, which is what you're seeing. The big sort of oil and gas companies in the West going, we need to modify, we need to adopt the green revolution. They're trying to find ways to survive. And ultimately, of course, it's going to fail. And then the flip side is you look at what the East's doing and how they're managing the process. I mean, everything's cooperation. They're signing trade deals. They're having regular meetings. They're resolving differences in an amicable way. And that's the stark contrast between what we're seeing, just describing in a bit more detail what's going on in the West. And for me, the biggest thing I see with and we'll maybe talk about this in a minute, let Veles speak. When you look at US foreign policy, it's all driven by abject fear. It's a fear of the future. It's this unknown quantity, this hegemonic powers in decline. What's the future going to be? Because they perceive China to do precisely what they've done to the rest of the world. And they're terrified of that. And I think that you get the feeling inside the Beltway, it's all fear generated. So all this policy decision is fear to try and galvanize they think is left of their empire to try and somehow stand up against an ascendant power that the vast majority of the world's moving towards, and Europe's a great example of that. So you've got the US, the UK predominantly trying to drag everyone else along in an empire that's collapsing, and most of their allies are going, we don't want any part of this anymore. I mean, yeah, they'll make some noise on the periphery. But as we've just said with Russia, they make noise about Navalny, and then they're going, no, we want to strike a deal with this and strike a deal with that, because they've realized that the future isn't in a failing empire.
Very well said, Paul. Veles, please.
Yes, thank you. Well, and to dovetail off of one of Paul's points, the relevancy issue. I saw that myself working directly with the Department of Homeland Security back in 2008, 2007, and with others in the years that followed when I was out in D.C. I've said this on shows I've done. I know some other folks have brought this up, Patrick Ryan and Matthew Arrett as well. The fear, not just in Washington, D.C., but in various governments around the world, is palpable for 2 or 3 reasons. Number one is because the public worldwide has such a better understanding of what's really happening. There was an article that came out this morning by someone saying that one of the greatest gifts Donald Trump gave the public was revealing even more of how far down the rabbit hole the deep state goes, or the bureaucracy, however you want to call it. World governments are struggling. We've discussed about the new financial model or tweaks to the existing model. The list goes on. But the net is the changes are coming. They're still obviously trying to map out what that's going to look like. I've literally been in meetings with topics such as I worked on an effort for DHS where we were trying to figure out a way to provide identity cards to migrant labor from South America to provide some kind of rule of law rather than just letting these folks get abused once they came across the border. Even then, the struggle to try and understand how to do it, were there commercial aspects of that could be replicated or what have you. They are worldwide. Most of the world's major governments, quote unquote major, are terrified of their own citizenry. They're terrified of what the citizenry might do. And that's why it's important for our audience to remember not to succumb to fear. To quote from the movie and the book series Dune, fear is the mind killer. You're being flooded by the mainstream media globally, who are entertainment mechanisms, not information mechanisms, with all of the things that you need to be afraid of. And George Friedman just yesterday dove into kind of the new normal in the sense of, and he made an interesting comment, I found it very thought-provoking, where he said, after World War II, the United States adopted a mindset of paranoia about surprise attack. And you can read a ton of foreign policy documentation and Foreign Affairs Magazine and International Affairs Magazine and similar, who for years have written articles about the fact that everything in U.S. foreign policy since 1945 has been based on the fear of a first strike, some way to knock out our government or similar. And one, I'm somewhat joking when I say this, but one could make the argument that we have some people in Washington, D.C. right now that are terrified that the citizenry is trying to figure out a way to do that themselves. And I'm not referring to the Capitol events. But Friedman's comment is that then after 9/11, we became accustomed to higher security procedures and similar. And that the challenge we face right now with the whole response, and that's the key word, response to COVID, is, are they just going to keep doing this forever? That whether using public transportation or what have you, that we're just going to remain masked for the next 40 years? I certainly hope not. But to this whole narrative is a couple of points my colleagues have made. You look at what people are doing, and that's where shows like this are important, and other sources out there are critical. When you look at the actions people are taking, and I'm talking about what happened with GameStop, and I certainly believe there were some other things going on behind the scenes there. Certainly Dr. Michael Burry, for those of you that know the movie The Big Short, Burry was heavily involved in that. Chamath, the gentleman who has aspirations of becoming governor of California, he had some hand in that. but it was part of a broader series of things that are taking place right now. The true takeaway to me of Bill Gates and the Chinese government, for that matter, purchasing farmland across the United States and oil fields in the United States is not necessarily geostrategic. It's asset based. Everyone's looking for assets. There was an article that came out this morning saying that the U.S. Mint is unable to keep up with demand for gold or silver coins. And of course, it's been discussed on this show by people much smarter than myself about the metals markets and what's been going on there. Everyone is searching for value. And I would portray that in two senses. The first is value for their own finances and future, but also value in their personal lives. People trying to find ways around the system. And final comment, this is when we start getting into the topic that's been discussed ad nauseum. I know I've brought it up many times about what appears to be a slow but progressive move towards balkanization in the United States at a legal and state level, but as well as other countries. I mean, we are literally witnessing, I'm being a bit facetious when I say this, but we're witnessing a similarity in the United States to what happened to India during the partition with Pakistan, where whole swaths of people left India to go to Pakistan, or people in what is modern day Pakistan moved back into India due to religious and cultural differences. We now have the same thing where huge numbers of New Yorkers are moving into Florida, huge numbers of Californians are moving into Texas. We are even the mainstream media, and I discussed this on a prior show, is now looking into the reality of changing congressional seats in the United States. We have people who have the ability to do so, and that's a key takeaway. There's a lot of people who can't get out of those metropolitan areas. But we have whole swaths of people in the United States, but also worldwide, that are moving to areas where they can preserve their liberty, whether financial or personal. And we're going to need to monitor and keep an eye on that, because it's definitely going to continue.
Real quick, gentlemen, I want to just the people, all the listeners that are tuning in, just remind you all that this is a roundtable discussion. I want to thank you for tuning in, whether you're on DLive, Twitch, Flow, wherever you're tuning in from. And just to give everyone a quick update in regards to one of the channels that we simulcast and live stream to is Rogue News. And we received a second strike on Rogue News last week. We still have not had the first strike removed. So therefore, we are on a 14-day ban, if you will, from uploading, from live streaming. So it's very important to find other venues, other platforms to tune in from. So we do have a backup channel, created, which is it's their Rogue Media TV. So make sure you hit that subscribe button. And just information is just so valuable right now. And we'll also be simulcasting over to the Gadfly YouTube channel. So and we have a couple other on backup in case we need them. We're kind of prepared for this. So I just wanted to let our audience know, because I see some people asking, why we're not getting notifications and all that kind of good stuff. So sorry to break it down that way, guys, but I just want to let the listeners know just, what was happening and why we're taking this approach to things. But I've enjoyed every bit of the conversations that everyone's happening. And it's difficult not to necessarily focus on the United States, just because there's so much happening around the world. But Paul, you had mentioned and said something in your opening statement in regards to the centralizing or focusing on Europe and Europe in general. What are the current alignments that are happening, geopolitical? What are your thoughts on who's in favor of what the transition looks like? What is the resistance? How's this kind of playing out, Paul?
Yeah, well, just a very brief history lesson. I know some people have heard me say this before, but Europe has always kind of been the key battleground for the Western Empire. We look at it historically through World War One. We look at what happened with the Versailles Treaty and what ultimately led to World War Two, and it's always an attempt to control that middle ground. Why? Because it allowed them to create NATO. It allowed them to create Russia as this the arch enemy. Why? Because it allows the military industrial complex to exist and function and operate. It allows them to push on to Russia's borders, to legitimately sort of have a presence in the old Baltic republics, etc. So, but Europe's been in a kind of transitional phase for quite a long time. There is certainly groups of individuals within Germany, and I've said this before, Holland, Austria, Finland, who very much were looking at ways of saying, okay, we need to rotate to some degree to the east. But I mean, that's, if you want to call it a deep state, call it whatever you like, that is their worst fear, is the integration of Germany into the Eurasian axis, which then extends this backbone, this fulcrum of what I've always called the Berlin, Moscow, Beijing, and you might as well throw Tehran into that axis now. So that's always been the big fear. But trade and commerce wants an end to all the hostilities because post 2014 and the Ukraine meltdown, they were the ones suffering hugely because Russia took the decision and said, okay, you want to force sanctions on it, we're going to de-dollarize, we're going to look for alternative import-export markets, and Europe sat there going, hang on a minute, Germany's got enormous presence inside Russia, and there's a huge presence of Russian companies inside Germany as one example. So trade and commerce on the one side want this rotation and want this change and want to integrate. And China was kind of the acceptable face for the European Union to do this. I mean, ideologically, Europe itself is divided. There are people who want to begin to normalize relations with Russia to some extent. And of course, there's the diehards who simply, what I would call notionally Atlanticists, the ones who just absolutely are vehemently opposed to this for all the reasons we've just discussed. But Europe itself, of course, was a failed experiment from day one. You can't marry North and South economies together and have some common kind of monetary policy and expect it to function. It was doomed to fail, and rather like the dollar's failing, so is the euro. I mean, the euro will probably be a currency that will have the shortest longevity of supposedly major currencies. I'm not an expert on the history of currencies, but it's 20 years old, just over, and it's already failing very badly. So problem inside Europe is there is populist movements that are sprouted up in nations. And of course, the sort of Brussels is terrified of this. And this may surprise people. One of the fundamental reasons they're terrified of it is because they think a populist government will evoke the 1930s in Germany again. That is what underpins a lot of their fear, because they actually believe there's a chance that could resurrect it. So I'm not saying exactly like Nazi Germany, but something equivalent to it. And there are populist moves, but ultimately a lot of European people are supportive, but when it comes to voting for them, they go, no, actually, we'll just stick with the status quo. And that's why we haven't seen enormous political change when people thought like Le Pen might succeed in France. Now, with regards to Italy, it proves that if you get this coalition of people perceived to be sort of outside the system and who maybe want to trade with Russia, want to trade with China, want to leave the European Union, the governments ultimately fail. There's too much infighting. And as Ken rightly points out, I mean, and I made a tweet earlier, welcome to Italy going back to the 20th century, because Draghi is not progression. Draghi's just there to try and shore up the system, try to prevent the growing despondency with Italy being in the European Union. And that's partly why, not entirely why, Europe's trying to make Britain suffer in a post-Brexit world, because they want to convince the rest of Europe, don't leave. Because once Italy leaves, for example, the floodgates will open and a whole bunch of nations will want to leave. But of course, ultimately, the European Union, as it exists now, will fail. So again, it's one of those things, they're trying to hold an empire together that's failing, and they think they can somehow normalize monetary policy, and somehow you can keep bailing economies out and just print trillions and trillions of euros and it will resolve the problem. Of course, we know it won't, and ultimately it will all fail. So Europe's kind of stuck in the middle. There's some interesting kind of moves towards the east, as I said earlier. There's some intransigence that wants to hang on to what they've got, but Europe's very divided. For example, over NATO, some people are saying, well, NATO no longer is relevant. And of course, you've got the Baltic states and Poland who are screaming that NATO needs to be enlarged and they need more missiles to protect them from Russia, because they've been brainwashed to believe that Russia's like the Soviet Union and might suddenly invade them, sort of 1942 style or something. So it's that kind of mindset. So there's a huge ideological problem that exists inside the European Union, but ultimately trade and commerce will probably win through eventually, because increasingly they're saying, we want to be part of the future. We want to be part of this target market, out, which is the East, which is Eurasia, and it wants to tie up, trade deals with Russia, for example. Hence, LNG gas via Nord Stream 2 is a great example. But at the moment, we don't have any leadership. It's just this vacuum. I mean, it's like, Merkel's been in Germany so long. Her replacement's really just a bit of a Merkel clone, maybe with slight difference of opinion. But there's no radical policy changes that exist amongst European leaders, because again, we don't have a meritocracy in Western government, so we don't actually have the right people. And this is my fear, and I think it's the fear inside the European Union, that when everything collapses, you're going to see the rise of populism. And populism in extreme circumstances can produce extreme governments. And there is that genuine fear. So as much as I am very anti-European Union for a lot of policies, the one thing it has done, on some level, it's preserved peace since World War II. And that, amongst a whole bunch of nations who have ideological problems with each other. So in that sense, it's been a degree of success. On most other levels, it's completely failed. So, but it's a melting pot. And I've always said, if you talk about fundamental changes, if Germany came out tomorrow and said, well, they can't, but just for argument's sake, they came out and said, we've got to leave the European Union. We're going back to the Deutschmark. And by the way, we're going to sign all these trade deals with Russia, and we're going to rotate east. That would be, the Western Empire would collapse in the blink of an eye, because it would be that monumentally changing. And that's why everything's done to try and preserve the status quo. But Germany, increasingly on political levels, okay, people don't like the AfD party, but they're very pro-Russia. They were in Russia recently meeting Lavrov. They have a very different perspective now. Maybe in the future they will get elected, for argument's sake. So there's all these things in a melting pot. Europe's a massively complicated problem. In some ways, it's way more complicated than the United States, but we are seeing changes, and I've tracked changes for 4 years, and it's following the path we expect it to follow. But as ever, there's no time constraint on this, and I've probably talked for too long.
Ken, your thoughts on that? I mean, in terms of populism, in terms of the EU agenda, I don't want to necessarily call it a globalist, agenda, utopia. What are your thoughts on that, especially as it relates to the United States now? Go ahead, Ken. Your thoughts.
Yeah, there's a number of old axioms that you bring them up, and people roll their eyes, but they're absolutely true. They just, like Mark Twain said, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it always rhymes. You always have the same type of things going on. You just have different environments, different scenarios where it occurs. The axiom I'm thinking about is, when trade doesn't cross borders, armies do. And when you take a look at virtually everything that's going on, it's all about dominion over money, dominion over trade. You could almost think about it, because America has become such a fascist state for so long, especially when the military-industrial complex took over, that nearly all foreign policy is based on ensuring that the corporations have dominion over the borders. The Belt and Road. China has decided to reestablish the Belt and Road, the Silk Road 2 thing, which is a trade institution. What's going on trying in Germany? You really have two governments. You have the Merkel government, and then you have big business, and they fight each other. Big business wants to throw away all this NATO anti-Russia crap, and they want to form trade alliances. You have the United States, which is sending out the fleet everywhere over oil, over trade, over dominion in that aspect. It's all pretty much everything that we're seeing here. Even the COVID crap. Think about it. COVID is being run at its core by an individual who is simply a political hack in Fauci, who's been around since the 1950s and 60s in NHS. And then you have Bill Gates, a college dropout who never invented anything, who built his company based on licensing somebody else's software, who thinks he's a medical doctor and a expert on vaccines. Okay, what Paul said about meritocracy, a government based on people who have ability to do these things. The fact of the matter is that in America, we have nobody with abilities anymore. And this is why America is dying. Every empire that has flourished has been done so based on invention and innovation, the ability to adapt, the ability to change, the ability to create something that makes life better. We did that up until about the 1990s. We no longer invented things. We just simply created mechanisms to try to make money. Not about making things better, but about making money. Well, the world in that aspect is, where are you seeing the innovations? Where are you seeing the adaptations? These are happening in places like China, India, Russia, Vietnam, a lot of the the Pacific Rim countries. You're seeing it in Africa. You're seeing it in everywhere but the United States and Europe. As a matter of fact, we're not even creating scientists anymore. We're bringing them in H-1B from India, from China, from everywhere else. So because we become stagnant, and those, when you go to more people are educated in the United States than ever before, or I should say more people have college degrees in America than ever before, but fewer people are educated than ever before. And so, this is just the recipe for destruction, because we're trying to keep a system that no longer functions going, and we're willing to bankrupt not just the United States. Europe's willing to bankrupt itself to keep that status quo, while elsewhere in the world, they are building, they are modernizing, they're trying to find ways to make things better for people as a whole. You could say in some places in the Middle East this is occurring, but in a lot of places they're still being run by their theocracy, their old 7th century ways. That's going to change at a certain point, but it's going to be a hard lesson. And unfortunately, America does not have anybody capable of stepping up to be able to take this, even to take it if we collapse. When that happens, I do not see anybody. And unfortunately, when you take a look at what history has shown, during the Great Depression, there were actually 4 different economic models that were being fought over, both by the populace and by the government. There was movements to bring in communism. There was movements to bring in socialism. We had just got done with the progressive era of 1900 and 1920. We had the rise of technocracy, where, just as you said, government run by experts. Then you had an attempt to bring about the return of capitalism, but it ended up being fascism, because there were many in Congress who actually loved what Adolf Hitler was doing in Germany, because why? It was successful. Even if it wasn't on the foundations, on the surface, it was successful at a time when they were bankrupt. So instead of going back and looking at why did we fail and making changes to why we failed, we just doubled down and we made it even worse. And the only thing that really took us out of it was we were successful in the war. But guess what? The only lesson they learned was we got to have continuous war, leading to the Cold War, leading to Vietnam, leading to everything else. Everything's been continuous war, because the military-industrial complex, the corporatocracy that rose out of World War II, has pretty much dominated and ruled everything. And so without war, America has Nothing. Even though before World War I, World War II, it was our productivity, is our invention, it was our innovation that led us to become the world power we are. But once we got there, we threw it all away and did what all other empires did. And now you see the end result for it.
Veles, your thoughts, please.
Couple of things. First, to revisit the European topic. We've got a couple of dynamics there, and especially in the case of the European Union, there's a lot of similarity, in my opinion, between where their thinking is and the U.S. Central Bank and, most of our major corporations. In the case of Europe right now, the thing I keep monitoring very closely is the situation with Hungary and Poland, because both of these countries, as well as most of Central Europe, have long histories and long memories of what has happened when they trust the wrong people, especially, unfortunately, in the case of Poland. And so the European Union, in many respects, has been trying to rein the two of those in, along with the rest of Central Europe, because they're trying to, and I'm talking about Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, etc. They're caught between the challenges of the problems Putin is trying to maintain inside Russia, including but not limited to both the Ukrainian situation and Belarus, as well as Europe on their border, not as a friendly power, really. There's a joke in Germany that says, not everyone in Germany believes in God, but everyone believes in the Bundesbank. And in Germany, the reality for the European Union is that the European Union's central banking planning is really whatever the Bundesbank, the old Bundesbank, says it is. So I have a friend of mine who I used to work with in consulting who jokingly said, pity Germany didn't understand that prior to the first two world wars, they could have accomplished a lot more by just simply trying to manipulate central banks rather than trying to conquer Europe through military means. But the European Union has immense problems, not the least of which are the countries along the Mediterranean, including but not limited to Spain, Italy, and Greece. So the European Union, as we know, during 2008 was experimenting with the idea of whether or not they were going to cut those countries loose. They're also trying to rein in Central Europe, who doesn't want that level of control. I think, ironically, the Central Europeans would probably go along with it if it weren't for all of these social mechanisms that the United States is now being exposed to thanks to COVID, but that have been going on in Europe for quite some time. And the European Union has its hands full. To Ken's point, to me, it's the global commoditization of labor. And again, I look to everyone from George Friedman to Patrick Ryan to even Matthew Arrett and a couple other guests that have been on the show. We went from an era where the human condition for the last few hundred years was that human beings were valuable, especially depending on the level of training they have, to Ken's point about people are not being educated in the correct way, or to quote Mark Twain, what was it? I never allowed my education to get in the way of my learning. But as time has gone on, and with the world's population as high as it is, human beings have become commoditized, regardless of what your skills are. And I've certainly seen that in the information technology industry, as whole swaths of the U.S. economy have been removed and wiped out in favor of offshoring. To a number of folks out there studying this problem, in the case of the European Union, their need for cheap labor was satisfied by trying to bring in people from North Africa or solve two problems with one solution, which was to drain out young men who could be fighting in Syria into the European Union as a low-cost labor force. The problem for Europe is that has created immense social pressures, as historically a lot of those folks are not keen on the idea of quote-unquote integration. The French have a number of authors who have raised with great hand-wringing their concerns about the fact that why is it that all of these people from North Africa don't want to be part of this great French experience. And we've certainly seen that play out in the social tensions in France over the past couple of years. In the case of the United States, we've been sourcing cheap labor predominantly from South America, including, but not limited to, just Mexico, which has equally caused conflicts on our own southern border. But this watering down of the value of people really, to me, is what you're seeing across the board. It's not just in economics, but it's socially. And it's why we've got folks in Washington, D.C., but also our Fortune 100, and especially as I've commented a couple of times about the attitudes of executives in Silicon Valley. They just kind of view everybody as things in a petri dish that they're going to play around with and see if they can make it a better world. But asking our opinion or trying to engage us in that process to them is laughable. I also have to wonder, now that Jeff Bezos has stepped down over at Amazon, whether or not he's either A, going into the Biden administration, or B, possibly also looking at aspirations of godhood in the state of California. So with that, I'll relinquish the floor.
Yeah, it's very interesting times, and there's been a few thought process in regards to what has evolved, post COVID, the time period that we're currently in, and a few commentators that have been out there are in the thought process that during this time period is when they are working, trying to establish perhaps what the next financial model looks like, what's it going to evolve to. And we know around the globe that fiat is failing miserably. Gentlemen, any thoughts of what the next currency, the next cycle looks like? And I'll open up the floor, whoever wants to take that on.
Well, I know that what we've got going is this push for digital currencies. China's already introduced it with benefits to see how, an experiment, a testing. Paul and I have talked about this many times. There's the fear that the world's going to go to this sovereign digital currency. The religious right is thinking it's the mark of the beast in the one world financial system. Then you have those who think that it's going to ban and get rid of cash. But in reality, until there's some bigger catalyst that brings everybody together, either out of fear or out of some way, you're never going to have this. It'll always be a black market. India recently banned the use of any cryptocurrencies in their country. Well, that's sort of a moot point, because much of India's economy is black market anyway, and Bitcoin, and other cryptocurrencies, fine, they go into the shadows, but they'll still be used. Doesn't matter. The whole point about where the world is going, future, really rests upon its moving away from dollar hegemony. And that doesn't mean that, contrary to what the media is trying to push and all that, it doesn't mean that China wants to dominate the currency landscape in the new system. What they want is they want equal footing, and they want other countries to be equal footing. Because if you think about it, if China relies upon having both an export and a domestic economy, then they can't afford to have such a strong currency that other countries can't trade with them. They want to have equal footing. They want to help build up other nations so that the trade is equitable, even though they do dominate when it comes to productivity. That's something else that's taken in place. Contrary to what anybody is saying in the Western media, China is now, not in 2028, not in 2030, China is now the number one economy in the world. And as the number one economy in the world, they should have the right and the power to dictate the global finance or monetary system, at least how it's going to be, at least an equal footing. Yeah, the U.S. can have their say. Other countries that are big in production and export should have a say. But the fact of the matter is that the world is waiting while the United States still, as we just saw with Myanmar, we're gonna sanction them. Okay, if the dollar is going to be used as a weapon, then the acceleration away from the dollar is going to make it a de facto non-currency very, very quickly. The point brought up at the beginning here was Europe. Europe is the linchpin. Well, you have some countries, Draghi taking over in Italy. You still have Spain that doesn't know what it wants to do. You have Brussels, but Germany is very quickly moving over. The UK just signed or wants to join one of the many trade agreements and trade alliances that are over in Asia. That includes Mexico and Canada. So their potential to go ahead and bypass SWIFT, bypass the dollar-based system, all these opportunities are flooding. And, in the end, I think it's going to go to a purely bilateral trade system, whether it's going to be based on gold or some other resource rather than just this continuous money printing. That's going to have to wait. But in the end, it's all about the dollar and all about the dollar's removal as the unipolar world currency.
Yeah, let me weigh in, and Paul, I'll turn the floor back to you here in a second, but I definitely wanted to catch in after that last comment. People have to also step back and remember or kind of internalize how critical the dollar is at the biggest levels of this game of the global economy, because you have to remember that most international debt is denominated in dollars and energy is denominated in dollars. Now, you want to watch grown adults lose their minds. Let me take you to Washington, D.C. and a couple bars I know on certain nights when the right people are there. And you start talking to them about what happens if American debt starts getting denominated in another currency. South America has felt that pain since the 70s. We kept loaning them money through the IMF and the World Bank. Depending on if you read the gentleman who wrote the book, Tales of an Economic Hitman or Confessions of an Economic Hitman and others, the South Americans certainly have a very strong view on that topic. But the net of it is that their debt was denominated in dollars, and we saw to it that it was that way. But what happens when energy is denominated in any other currency? Well, that's going to have some serious impact to U.S. GDP, as it would to other countries who for years have adjusted their economies in that regard. Equally, there was a comment made that during the negotiations that the prior administration was having with China, the prior U.S. administration was having with China, that one of the realities of why those negotiations were getting so bogged down was any major decision that China might have to adopt was going to require a massive adjustment to how their economy operates. And that's not an easy pill for the Chinese to swallow, even if they want to go in that direction. The same is true if we were to remove the dollar as the primary exchange or the benchmark currency internationally to quote unquote something else, whatever that might be. And equally to the point about China, China is in many respects trying to seek parity. They just want to be able to sit at the World Economic Forum. They want to be able to sit on various international regimes that determine the rules about trade and cargo and exchanges and so on and penalties and at The Hague and similar things. And that goes for having an exchangeable currency. It's the old joke about nobody in their right mind wants to run the world, but everybody wants to be sitting at the table where the people who do run the world are making decisions. That's what China has been trying to pursue for generations. And quite frankly, that's a deep-seated cultural component to the Chinese psyche, because if you were to speak to people from China, or for that matter, even Taiwan, they're very unified in their view of their pain and their anger over the historical consequences of colonialism and China being chopped up into just little regions by various European powers where they were nothing more than a source of raw materials. Now, a number of African leaders, you have to go hunt these stories down because you're not going to find them in traditional media, but a number of African leaders have said quite loudly over the past 10 years that they find it ironic that a country who's so in tune with its own cultural history with colonialism is one of the worst colonial powers in Africa at times in the way in which they operate. But at its heart, yes, China is just seeking parity. China just wants to be at the table as this new system comes out. But we've got very powerful players in the form of the European Union, the United States, China, Russia, and others who, as this system takes shape, are trying to make sure that they don't wake up, as the old joke goes in business, and find out that there was a provision in the contract that's not in their best interest. And for the United States and our central bank and many of our major corporations, including our largest banks, any shift in how you denominate debt, in how you denominate energy is simply biblical. There's just no other way to put it. Paul?
Yeah, you make great points, Veles. And again, it comes back to this thing where there's this massive oversimplification of how governments operate and how the world operates. But what I've said this many times before, for me, I had fortunately, I had what I've termed the architects of the reset who approached me way back when, and I've had countless discussions and contact on all manner of things since that point in around 2010. And pretty much everything they told me in 2010 is unfolding now. And again, there's no time frame on this. So when people talk about the reset, we're probably 80% of the way through the reset. It's just the West is thrashing around trying to keep the status quo the way it is. And when I say the West, increasingly, it's not, we're seeing Europe's kind of flapping a bit or bending in both directions, but increasingly bending more towards the East because it realizes that that's in the ascendancy. But absolutely, China has no intention of wanting to be the world's reserve currency or an hegemonic power because it knows ultimately you end up like the United States. So what is the point in doing this? So, okay, people can have varying points of view over what they're doing, but it took probably till about 2018, 2017, when the US suddenly woke up to the realization that China and Russia were everywhere in the world. Wherever they turn to, they're already there. They've already got some sort of economic footprint there, or maybe there's some military footprint there. Africa is one example where Russia has a very covert presence in a lot of countries. And they suddenly had this realization. In fact, of course, China owns huge amounts of the United States, which most Americans don't even understand anyway. So, yeah, the future is very much, we have to have a multipolar world. The rationale and thinking is, and why I call it a paradigm shift is, what that does is eventually it builds these poles up all over the world. So Africa eventually, okay, we're not talking overnight, we're talking, let's look at the next 50, 100 years or something. But eventually Africa will be a strong continent. The Middle East will be. Southeast Asia will be. Eventually Europe will be. And eventually even, the United States can be a great nation amongst equal. If you build this up, there's all this interdependency and you have strong, vibrant, you're not then going to want to compete with each other and want to have any hegemonic power. That was the basis in many senses. I've said this before, it's a reboot of humanity. The very core and essence of what makes humanity to effectively tick and to change the mindset that we're not going to go through this process anymore of endless conflict, endless war, endless dominance, or the desire, this zero-sum game mentality, etc., etc. And of course, the byproduct of that is you have to change the financial environment. You have to change how economies operate, how nations trade amongst each other. And that's what's been going on really particularly for the last decade or so. I mean, China's had a presence in nations prior to that, but there's been a real acceleration in that process and a huge acceleration since 2014. And the Maidan was really probably the United States, one of their biggest failures, because it just made everybody go, hang on, enough's enough. And that's why China-Russia signed that in 2014, the Holy Grail energy deal, the power of Siberia gas pipeline, all traded in non-dollar terms, why Rosneft now trades with Europe in euros, and why the petrodollar is in serious decline. As are other commodities, we're seeing, and I've covered this on my own podcast, but we talked about this before, where big commodity trading houses are trading with China in the yuan. So there's this move away from commodities and all trade being in dollar terms. There's people trading in bilateral currencies, even within the Eurasian Economic Union, for example. And that's why this de-dollarization process has been ongoing. And ultimately, of course, when it reaches a critical mass, then the dollar ceases to have any validity as it has done effectively since Bretton Woods. And that's the fundamental shift. That's what this is about now. At some point, China, Southeast Asia, and the rest of the world want the Americans there's going to have to come a pinch point where the Western powers it down. But the Chinese, the Russians, and everyone else say, okay, we have to hold up the white flag. We admit it's over. And we're going to have some changes made. And the changes are going to be very uncomfortable for the United States, but they'll be pushed into a position where they'll have no choice but to do that. And really, that's kind of the culmination of the reset. So all this great reset with the World Economic Forum is just baloney. I mean, the World Economic Forum is just a talking shop of people who never make any decisions, nothing changes. And I think if you look at Xi and Putin's speeches at the recent Davos forum, they basically, Xi was going, this is the future, and people are going, this is utopian nonsense. And the world's going, well, actually, quite a lot of us are already moving in that direction. And Putin made the most significant comment was when he said there was this idea of this utopian world order. Well, it no longer exists. In fact, it never existed. There was an attempt to do it, and that now resides in history. And that's the reality. There was never any unipolar world in the strict sense of the word. There was none of this centralized governance of anything. That is just a myth that belongs in the history of myths. And I think more than anything, Putin and Xi were saying, this is the future. This is where the world's going. You've got a choice. You can either join us. We can find compromises. We can work together. You know, you could, I mean, the United States can do it painfully and take 20, 30 years, or it can do it in a mature way and say, okay, we acknowledge the problems. Okay, we need to reindustrialize America. How can we do this? How can we cooperate and make that work? Because without that cooperation, the US can't do it. What's it going to do? Just print trillions of dollars itself to reignite its domestic market? You can't do it. How does it move from being a hugely import-based economy and then have the devalued currency is going to have hyperinflation on imports? So there's all these problems. It can't remedy them, but it has to reach a point where somewhere within the United States says enough's enough, and there's a consensus to move away from this system that's failing and is destroying the United States just internally, but also it's destroying the United States' reputation. I mean, in the last 5 to 10 years, the damage US foreign policy and general US attitudes has done is staggering. So these are all these, so that's why this reset is ongoing. It's not, someone's going to magically produce it, you know, tomorrow or next week, or the World Economic Forum's dictating. It's already been going. It's everything that the East is doing. It's all the multipolar world developments. That's the future. That's where most of the world's moving. Just some nations in the West, the UK and the US being great examples, are rigidly trying to hang on to a system that's failed. And to varying degrees, the rest of the world's fully embracing it or partially embracing it to whatever extent. And that, you know, is essentially where we are.
Yep. Very well said, Paul. Gentlemen, I want to give each of you a couple minutes for just closing comments, and then I want to just real quick upnote to the show as well. So we'll start with you, Ken, and then we'll go to Veles and Paul. So a couple minutes each with closing comments, please.
You know, something that stands out to me where you see one half of the world start wanting to move towards a new paradigm, a new future, and the other half trying to retain is the ages of the politicians and the bureaucrats that are in office. You know, who would have thought that we would have a large portion of our leadership in their 80s, just desperately trying to hang not only on to power, but also to hang on to a dying system. It's going to take new blood, new innovation, new thought, even if it's not necessarily what we had, you know, because if you think about it, if you were 18 to 21, you were considered one of the leaders of the 1776 revolution. When Lafayette came over, he was 18 years old and he was a general. I mean, that's how young the people were at the time that brought about and created this nation. What you saw in Europe, a lot of that occurred between the end of the Roman Empire and into the Renaissance. Youth and this desire for something new were the big key catalysts. We made fun of millennials for so long, but you know what? It was the millennials and the Gen Zs who have the audacity to take on the old man hedge funds, the old billionaires, to try to change the system, to try to break the old system. We're going to see this. The youth are going to rise up. We saw it all summer when they were setting fire to the cities. This is occurring all across the Western world. And eventually, either the old guard, the Nancy Pelosi's, the Schumers, the Feinsteins, the Bidens, they're going to fall by the wayside because they're going to be overwhelmed because they've gotten to the point where change is impossible to take place. But we are in a frequency shift, as I've said, that occurs every second and third decade of every century. And it's going to overwhelm. It's not just going to overwhelm those in power. It's going to overwhelm the people. It's going to overwhelm the world. The question that remains is, what is the world going to look like when we enter that fourth century? Well, last century, of course, the 1930s was a very trying time, leading, of course, for the next 2 decades of depression and World War. Even then, when we came out of it, we did have that belief in the new frontier, the 1960s, but it's still a long time away, and things are piled on much greater. The debt is greater. The communication is greater. The world is smaller. So as they say, when the United States catches or sneezes, the world catches a cold. Now all of a sudden, where they used to call the Ottoman Empire the sick man of Europe, the United States is the sick man of the world governance. At a certain ticking point, there's going to be a switch where the leadership is going to fall by the wayside. There will be a new rise up of ideas, of thoughts, and we still don't know if it's going to be beneficial or if it's going to be what they're trying to impose, more totalitarianism. So, each day brings something new. Each day is just on the road towards that, and you got to be prepared to pivot whatever way it's going to be.
Veles.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I've got some stuff mapped out for Friday that I think we can cover then. In my typical sense of humor, I'm just going to sit back and wait for the Biden administration to appoint Freddie Krueger head of Health and Human Services. I swear to God, they're just sitting there with a clipboard going, let's see if they react if we do this. But anyway, with that, I'll turn it over to Paul.
Yeah, I think obviously it's an ongoing discussion. There's, what I've tried to do, and we've tried to do since the inception of the Gadfly, and obviously I did it when I used to be on Rogue as well, is to try kind of lay out what we understand and where we're going and what the future is and why this aspect is very significant and this other aspect maybe isn't so significant. And it's just trying to understand and just get to the nub of the reality of things. And that's why I made the point. I get very kind of exasperated by the whole kind of media circus that is not just the mainstream media, but the alt media, and why we're endeavoring to get to the heart of what's going on and understanding the reality of things. And I'll just leave you with a couple of little amusing anecdotes. Interesting and amusing on one level. I don't think I've ever said this. Actually, one of my distant relations was one of Lafayette's right-hand men. And the other thing is, I had a not so distant relation who one time was in the JFK administration and actually told him to F off. And that is factually true. So you might get a bit of an idea that there's a certain streak that runs in the family. And I'll leave it at that.
Very good. Very good. Gentlemen, I want to thank you all for a great discussion today, looking at the comments and the chat room. I think everyone truly enjoyed it. I enjoyed it as well. And again, I think how we approach this thing, just in my closing comments real quick, is that we cannot have a single point of communication failure. And with watching what the tech oligarchs are doing with shutting down multiple platforms, we have to be agile and be able to get to different outlets, whether it's Twitch, YouTube, Float, wherever it is. So it's just important right now to assess that. So please do me a favor. make sure to go over to Rogue News, bookmark that site because our streams will be appearing there. If you have not done so yet, check out the gadfly.vhx.tv and subscribe to the different channels, the different platforms. We're on 2 strikes on Rogue News. We're hoping to get those removed. The writing's on the wall in terms of what YouTube wants to do. So we do have a couple of backup channels. You can subscribe to the Gadfly on YouTube, and then also the other site that I didn't bookmark properly. But oh well.
Twitch and D Live as well.
Yep, absolutely. So, gentlemen, enjoy your day. And for our listeners, thank you for tuning in and be safe. And we're over and out.